13. Suffer the little children. It was another cloudless morning, with nothing visible save two contrails streamed like sheep's wool strands across the azure dome of the sky. A glad morning, as Olivia would say to her mother, and one which she was happy to watch for minutes, then hours, despite the crisp coldness that pinched her exposed nose. She was seated in her favourite camping chair on the pavement outside the mid-terraced house her parents and then her sister and husband had owned. That she was positioned on the busy main road held no fear for her, nor did it detract from her joy at being simply out in the open and watching the world go by. It being Sunday, the traffic was limited to saloons taking the devoted to denominational churches scattered throughout the local community. Alternatively, 4x4s carried families on hastily planned trips to the Lake District, in the case of the active, or in estate cars to Drumcastle for the latest film or a trip to Strikes for the more leisurely inclined. Nevertheless, Izzy, Olivia's sister, had insisted she wear her luminous yellow jacket just to be on the safe side. Olivia wasn't in the habit of wandering off, but Izzy told her you could never be too careful.
"Remember how you got lost in the co-op last week? It was only in the next aisle, but you caused a right rumpus. I wouldn't like to think what'd happen if you lost your bearings out on that street." "You don't have to worry," Olivia said in her mind, although she was conscious that the words came out sounding much different. During her 38 years of existence on this planet, she'd not formulated a proper sentence once, and she knew how it made her sound. Having profound hearing impairment in both ears didn't help, made her sound like a retard. Of course, no one used that word in her presence now, although they had when she'd attended the local secondary school, Valley High. "I won't go anywhere," she'd said to Izzy. "I just like to watch." And it was true, she did. Watching, smelling, hearing, what little she discerned. "Morning, Olivia," the voice came from her right. She turned her head and shielded her eyes against the sun that shot beams out like lasers on Star Wars, her favourite film. As the man came into view, she recognised Mr. Moore, the man with the coal-dust wrinkled face. Olivia didn't know if Mr. Moore had ever been a coalman or a miner, but she wasn't able to offer any other explanation for his violet-stained complexion. He stopped next to her and looked across the road in the direction where she'd been staring. Turning back and mouthing the words in an exaggerated fashion, he said, "What do you see in the sky today, then?" "Birds, planes," Olivia said. "The blueness, too." She lifted the thick-rimmed spectacles from her nose and rubbed her eye, letting them drop back when she'd finished. "Sometimes the sky looks like the sea," she said, "and it makes me think the world is upside down." "Oh, you're right about that," Mr. Moore said, laughing, then finishing with a cough that rattled deep down in his lungs. Olivia thought the sound wasn't healthy, reminded her of her dad's cough in the months before he'd taken the long trip. "Yep," he continued, once he'd cleared his airway. "Completely topsy-turvy, that's for sure." Olivia was glad Mr. Moore agreed with her. She imagined it was only her who saw these things. Others said they did, but she could tell from their voices they didn't really appreciate what she was trying to say. Something about the tone that said, "I'm listening to what you're saying, but don't ask me to understand your cock-a-hoop ramblings." "Well, must be getting along," he said. "That Sunday lunch won't cook itself." Olivia chuckled as she imagined a raw chicken climbing out of the fridge and hopping over towards the oven. The imaginary fowl then opened the door, climbed in, and reached out to turn the dial, switching it on. "Sounds like you're holding on to a good joke there, Livy. Care to tell an old codger?" Olivia shook her head. Only she understood her thoughts properly, and she wasn't sure she'd be able to explain why she found Mr. Moore's statement so funny. "Have a nice day," she said, in a Californian accent she'd picked up from a film she'd watched the previous night. It had starred Cameron Diaz, and she loved the way the US farewell warmed her heart. She concluded that if she warmed someone else's heart using those words, then the world would definitely be a better place. "Missing you already?"
Mr. Moore replied, pointing his finger at her and shuffling off into the distance. A clamorous ringing from across the road startled her as the bells of St. Cuthbert's started up.
11 o'clock,
she said, looking at the large clock face recessed into the red brick tower opposite. Soon the bells were singing their usual Sunday morning melody. Olivia hummed the tune out loud, sometimes getting ahead of the bell ringers, but pulling it back when she realised she'd been too speedy for them. The people would appear from the front door of the church soon, and she anticipated identifying a few new faces amongst them. Reverend Taylor would be at the door, wearing his black and white vestments and shaking their hands and sharing the peace of the Lord. Olivia wondered which peace of the Lord he was imparting. She remembered from what her mother had told her that they actually ate his body inside the church and drank his blood. So how there would be anything left of him to share, she didn't know, and she'd never plucked up the courage to ask. Some questions can only be asked as a child, and, if held back, are condemned to the chests of ignorance for a lifetime. Olivia appreciated this on a subliminal level, and no one had ever indicated this was anything other than the truth. The bells clanged to a halt after an unusually short period, and Olivia noted it was an uncharacteristically ugly manner in which they did so.
"That's wrong," she said to herself. "There's another verse to go yet."
The arched oak door to the church was still closed too, another thing that wasn't right. The whole town seemed to have fallen under a pall of quietude. No cars swept by, and no pedestrians were visible. It wasn't a nice silence in Olivia's mind, more akin to the stillness before an unhappy event, like the silence falling over her sister when Dad had breathed his last. Olivia rose from the camp chair and stepped towards the curb. She worried that Izzy would scold her, but somehow she had to find out what was wrong. For she was sure now, in a way that only those whose senses have been deprived are sure, that something was amiss. She remembered her Green Cross code from youth and looked both ways up and down Drumcastle Road, straining her inadequate sense of hearing all the time for approaching traffic. When she was certain it was clear, she scuttled across the tarmac in a semi-skipping sort of way she'd adopted ever since she could put one foot in front of the other. Once she'd reached the cobbles on the other side of the road, she breathed in deeply for a few seconds, not so much from exertion, more the after-effects of knowing she'd taken a major step into the unknown. Now she would take several more. She climbed the stone steps of the church one at a time, thinking at any moment the door would creak open and there would stand Reverend Taylor welcoming people out from the ecclesiastical gloom. But no one came. As she approached the door, she thought she heard a low moan, followed by a shriek, cut off short before it reached the zenith of its crescendo. Perhaps it had been a phantom voice. Olivia had talked about these many a time when she told her sister about conversations she conducted with friends in the ancient house. Olivia often detected whisperings in the bathroom or murmurings in her bedroom, sometimes emanating from behind the wood panelling or from beneath the sitting-room floorboards. When she told Izzy about these occurrences, she'd look at Bill, her husband, in a knowing way. She obviously thought Olivia didn't notice, but girls like Olivia always knew. They just didn't question it. She was enough trouble for normal folks as it was. She drew close to the door and placed her ear to the wood. Despite her severe impairment, she picked up faint sounds beyond. They weren't happy sounds at all. Not that church sounds were ever that happy, consisting as they were of mournful hymns and solemn chants. But these were cries of human misery and pain, interspersed with something that sounded like whump. She put her hand on the wrought iron handle and hesitated. She shouldn't be here. She was being silly, and Izzy wouldn't be pleased. She was about to turn round and head back when another whump issued from the church, followed by a loud scream.
"That's a child scream,"
she said to herself, and this made her mind up. She turned the handle and pushed the door inward a touch, just enough for her to peer through the crack created. Beyond the door were two thick curtains, draught excluders to protect the congregation from the icy fingers of winter. What she saw caused her breath to stop in her throat. A woman was crawling along the central aisle towards her, the face looking upwards as if gazing towards the finishing line of a race. Olivia couldn't make out the woman's features because rivulets of blood obscured them, running from a point on her head where the hair was matted together around a cleft in the skull. This wasn't the only atrocity to confront Olivia. Over in the pews to her right, she saw bodies slumped over. Some of them possessed movement, the twitch of an arm or the shifting of a head. Most did not. She scanned to the left and observed a group of children cowering in the corner. One of their number was laid across the knees of two others, face turned upwards, eyes staring blankly. None of them could have been above 6 years old. All were crying and hugging each other, glancing round as if searching for whatever monster had inflicted such carnage. Olivia wondered herself where the source of these assaults could be. Was this one of those terrorist massacres she'd seen examples of on TV over the last 6 months? If so, why no gunfire or explosions? She looked forward again and noticed most people in the small congregation had occupied the front 2 pews. Just like the others, they were sprawled across the benches or stretched out on the brown twist carpet. Hymn and prayer books were scattered about the floor, some lying open with blood on their pages. Just in front of the altar was the prone body of another member of the clergy Olivia recognised as Deacon Gregory. Next to him was a broken decanter that had once contained the blood of his Lord, a Lord that may have died for him, but was powerless to resist the evil unleashed in this hallowed building. Fear paralysed Olivia. She found it difficult to make decisions at the best of times, but in stressful circumstances her senses tended to shut down and produced a kind of tunnel vision that usually took hours to recover from. Incidents she filed under stressful included going to a different place or meeting new people. So what confronted her here could reasonably be summarised as off the scale. Her breaths, like those of a small mammal, wheezed through her windpipe, her heart pulsing in her ears like a galloping horse. She was caught between wanting to run away and helping these poor unfortunates littered around. A sound from up in the belfry drew her attention. A man's laughter, not joyful. The sound of a man taking delight in something horrible. The man shouted defiantly. The voice sounded elderly, but the words were garbled. The whumping sounded again, followed by more laughter. "Ache! Own!" came a voice from the aisle. It was the woman with the caved-in skull. She'd seen Olivia and was holding something out to her. Olivia recognised it as a smartphone. Izzy owned one and sometimes lent it to her so she could play games like Angry Birds or Farm Heroes. But Izzy hadn't mastered the skill of texting or using the phone function. She had difficulty colouring in, never mind forming letters or operating complex sequences of numbers. As she watched, the woman's eyes glazed over and her head fell to the floor with a dull sound. "That'll be a nasty bruise," Olivia thought, then understood that maybe this was the least of the woman's problems. The phone was still in her hand, the front panel glowing white. Olivia looked towards the belfry, but couldn't detect anything. She tried to weigh the options, but the task was too difficult and, in the end, allowed the prospect and pleasure of holding a smartphone to be the determining factor influencing her next action. Pushing the door further inward, she stooped low and entered, making sure to carefully close it behind her, an action most astute for one considered so backward. She took the phone from the woman's hand and retreated between the back 2 rows of pews, smelling the odour of old books and musty prayer cushions as she crouched in the shadows. On the phone's screen, a name appeared, followed by a number. She didn't recognise either piece of information, but guessed it must be someone trying to contact the dead woman in the aisle. The realisation struck Olivia that she'd just pronounced the woman dead. How did she know? The same way she'd known her dad was gone that late November. Not the lack of breath from the nostrils or the fact that his chest didn't rise or fall anymore. It was to do with the absence of something, like the essence of the person had departed. She'd seen this in the way the woman's hand was splayed open, the phone laid in the centre of her palm. Although Olivia had never called anyone on a mobile before, she remembered what an old-fashioned phone and receiver looked like. She saw a picture of one at the bottom right of the screen.
What would happen if I pressed that? She thought. No harm in trying.
She pressed the icon, and the screen changed to the picture of a phone with waves emanating from it. The device purred softly for a few seconds, and then someone answered. It was set to speakerphone, and the volume was loud, too loud for Olivia to feel comfortable. The monster might hear, but she didn't know how to turn it down. "Hi, Chloe. Are you out of church yet?" came the male voice. Olivia froze. To speak to a stranger wasn't an activity that lay in her comfort zone. In fact, you could safely say it was well within the hazardous category of her experience. But something told her she had to be brave, that this was a time to push the boat out, as Izzy sometimes urged her. "Help!" Olivia said in a faltering voice. She knew it would sound nasal, like a caricature of a disabled person, like a David Walliams or Matt Lucas creation. But she swallowed her shyness and spoke up again. "Help us, please." "Who is this?" asked the voice. "Olivia," she said. "Olivia who?" "Olivia Hardwick." There was a pause. Then, "Are you a friend of Chloe's?" Olivia thought for a moment. Was she the woman's friend? She supposed she was. "Yes," she replied. "So, is Chloe there?" "Not any more," she said with confidence. "Sorry, I didn't catch that." "No, she's not. She's dead," Olivia said. "She's what?" "Chloe's lying in the church, dead. There are other dead people too." Again, these were the words in Olivia's head, but her tongue had a habit of treacherously retranslating the meaning. "Hey, is this a sick joke?" Olivia was getting beyond flustered. She couldn't cope when people got angry, and this man was furious. Or maybe he was just afraid, like her. "I can't tell very good jokes," she said, "and I don't think I should be telling one anyway." Something about Olivia's way of speaking must have struck home with the man, because he said, "I'm going to call the police." "Yes," Olivia said. "The police will help." "Listen, Olivia, I don't understand what's happened, but as I said, I'm going to ring off now and call the police. Once I've done that, I will call you back. It's important." "No, don't do that," Olivia said. "He might hear." "He?" "The monster." "Right, okay. You just hang in there. Help is on its way." The man's voice was getting shaky, and Olivia could tell he was stressed too. "Right," she said. "I'll wait here." "You do that, Olivia," he said, and rang off. Olivia looked at the phone as if it had betrayed her and lowered it to the floor. A sound from the front of the church drew her attention, and she froze. Muffled footsteps could be heard, one slow footfall followed by a dragging sound. Over this was an intermittent snuffling. If she was hearing the sounds in this muted manner through her hearing aids, then whatever made the noises was likely to be a lot closer than her impairment indicated. What to do? Should she seek a peek over the pew? Her choice was taken away when a mewling sound was followed by a pause in the footsteps. "The children. The monster has seen the children."
"Ah, little ones, I'd forgotten about you,"
said a gurgling voice. The creature took another couple of shuffling steps and then broke out into uncontrolled giggling. Olivia would remember that laughter for the rest of her days. It would mingle with the voices from behind the walls in her home, calling her name in that whispering tone.
"You thought you'd escaped, didn't you?"
said the voice, more quietly this time, and Olivia realized the monster had turned its back on her.
"I'll risk a look."
Before she could argue against herself, she raised her head slowly, watching the polished wood of the pew sink in her field of vision and the wider view of the church appear. She winced as her head cleared the top and breathed out in stages when she saw the back of a man wearing a blood-stained cassock. Beyond this, 3 children hunched together on the floor, while a further 2 ran away, screaming at the tops of their voices. One girl, who must have been only 4 years old at most, had the good sense to head towards the door. Why the others hadn't moved, Olivia couldn't comprehend. But they'd chosen badly, because the monster who she now recognised as Reverend Taylor loomed before them. In one hand he held a large ornate candlestick. Blood dripped from it, and she shuddered as she recognised bits of grey tissue and hair glued to the end. A posset of bile threatened to rise in her gorge, but she swallowed hard and closed her eyes, wishing the sudden sick feeling away. There are feats of human endurance universally admired, but also actions that constitute acts of heroism despite being simple and straightforward, simply because they are undertaken by those we think incapable of performing them. Olivia Hardwick made a decision of destiny in that second. It was recorded in national newspapers for weeks to follow, and would serve as a bulwark against the ghost whispers that would haunt her in the future. She stood up and shouted at the monster, "Don't you touch them!" Reverend Taylor's head whipped round, and Olivia saw that indeed he was a monster. The image she'd hoped for was based on her views from a distance every Sunday morning from across the street. A kindly man, looking much like Professor Calculus from the Tintin adventures, only in reality his moustache wasn't as long as the cartoon version. Other than this, he could have been a perfect facsimile, even down to the Harry Potter spectacles. The version that confronted her now was a perversion of that image. Eyes no longer containing the warmth of human kindness glinted with cruelty. The mouth curled up at one side in an expression that was neither smile nor grimace, but conveyed murderous intent. Wisps of hair floated above the sweaty, bald crown like crimped wire, while the rest of his face was almost completely obscured by mandarin sludge that dropped like a viscous waterfall onto his cassock, mixing with blood to form a parody of a spilled trifle.
"Another little bird in the bush,"
he said, and shuffled towards her.
"I'll get the others later. You're a much bigger prize."
His last sentence spluttered out between lips coated with the gunk. Olivia looked around and took 2 careful steps back. They had called her slow-witted in the past, but she was anything but slow on her feet. She reckoned she could outrun the sludge monster as long as she didn't cave in to fear. But where to go? If she ran out of the door, she'd be leaving the children open to attack. She could try to evade him within the building, but would the police get here in time? If only there was a weapon, something she might throw or poke him with. She was pretty sure she wouldn't fare well against the Reverend's bulk and strength at close quarters. She was only a 5'2", 150-pound waif. No, she would not outdo him in hand-to-hand combat. The sludge monster had stopped talking and scuffled towards her, lifting the bloody candlestick high. He'd be upon her in moments, so she did what anyone in her position would do. She ran. There wasn't any choice in the direction she took, just a scurrying escape from a man she still couldn't believe had inflicted such carnage. She found herself in the main aisle, just in front of the altar, observed an elderly man lying on his back, eyes staring at the ceiling, head stoved in like a hard-boiled egg containing a grey and red yolk. Her stomach took another churning tumble, and she looked away. Her eyes came to rest on the altar itself. It was covered in a purple velvet coverlet. Upon it were arranged a golden cross, an offering plate, and a single candlestick at the far side. The one that had occupied her end of the hallowed table was now in the Reverend's hand as he continued his relentless pursuit. None of these objects would serve as a means of defence, all unwieldy and therefore useless. Then, behind the altar, she spied a wooden pole, some 8 feet in length, crowned by a brass hook. It leaned in one corner next to an arched stained-glass window. Olivia had seen these in the village hall when she'd attended firstly as a brownie and then a girl guide back in her childhood days. She knew they were used to open and close inaccessibly high windows. She never got a chance to retrieve the pole. Taking a glance at the sludge monster, she saw with dismay that he had closed the gap. No time to weigh up the pros and cons. She retreated backwards, felt her heels strike the man with the eggshell skull, and with a cry of dismay fell over backwards. With a speed she wouldn't have credited the Reverend with, he lunged forward and brought the candlestick down in an arc. Without thinking, Olivia rolled to the side, not quickly enough to prevent the candlestick striking her leg, but with a speed that probably saved her life. Her leg went numb as she rolled down the altar steps and came to rest at the bottom. She lifted her head and witnessed Reverend Taylor stumbling over Eggshell Man and stepping towards her. She scooted backwards, wincing at the pain in her calf muscle. It wasn't clear whether it was broken or not, but it hurt like buggery, a phrase used by her dad in the days when he'd been fit enough to land a hammer blow on his thumb while constructing a doll's house. The move only gained her a couple of seconds, and she realised she'd have to gain her feet again to stand any chance of survival. She shuffled back further to put distance between herself and the attacker, but came to a halt when her back struck the front pew. Reverend Taylor loomed over her, candlestick held high, ready to deliver a killing blow. As she looked at his leering features, she had time to conclude that maybe she had bought the children some time. In the distance, sirens wailed. Help would be here soon. She closed her eyes and waited for the bludgeoning impact that must surely come.
For what you are about to receive,
the sludge monster cried.
May the Lord make you truly grateful.
The blow never landed. Instead, the assailant was shoved to one side, as if nudged by something. As Olivia's eyes focused, she saw him moved repeatedly to the side in jerking increments, the result of the pole she had seen behind the altar. A 5-year-old boy wielded the makeshift weapon, the one who had held the body of a younger child as he crouched at the back of the church.
"Take that, you nasty man,"
the boy said. The blows weren't forceful enough to do the Reverend any harm, but they served as a distraction and put him on the defensive. Olivia thought the boy's words were funny, given what she would have called him, but she had no time to reflect. The Reverend caught hold of the pole and pulled it from the boy's grasp. He said, looking at the makeshift spear. No longer capable of intelligible speech, he cast the candlestick aside, turned the pole round, and pointed it at the boy. The expression on the boy's face was one of abject terror. He'd frozen, incapable of forcing his little legs to movement.
"No," Olivia thought. "This isn't how it should end. The monster should be killed or captured."
Children didn't die in the stories she'd been read. This just wasn't fair. "Armed police! Stop where you are!" came a shout from the back of the church. Olivia didn't see who uttered the command, but heard at least half a dozen heavy footsteps and further barked instructions given in muted voices. She looked back at the Reverend. He seemed not to take any notice of the man and stepped menacingly towards the boy, pulling the hooked pole back, ready to strike. "Don't do it, Reverend," came the voice again. "You try to hit that boy, and we shoot." The sludge monster didn't even give the instruction a second's acknowledgement. He tensed for the strike, then jerked backwards as a single shot rang out in the House of the Holy.